I want to start by saying something that is going to sound strange, coming from someone in my position. I liked them. That is not the approved phrasing. In the Commission, we are trained to use language like developed professional appreciation or cultivated productive observational rapport. We are not supposed to say liked. It implies bias. It implies that the observer has stopped observing and started participating, and observers are never supposed to participate. But I liked them, the humans. I liked them before I understood them, and after Meridian, I understood them in ways I am still not finished processing. So let me start at the beginning, or close to it. The actual beginning would take years to explain. Let me start where it matters. My full name is Zethorian Savar, and I spent 4 standard years on Earth before my reassignment to Meridian Station. 4 years watching humans in their natural habitat, as the Commission literature so delicately puts it. I was sent because of my secondary specialization in primate social behavior, which apparently made me uniquely qualified to study a species that had only been confirmed sapient 43 years prior. I will not be apologetic about the Commission's initial classification. It was wrong, yes, catastrophically wrong as it turned out, but we had our reasons and they seemed sound at the time. Humans, when you first encounter them, do not read like apex intelligences. They are loud. They are emotional in ways that seem to serve no strategic function. They cry at music. They form deep attachments to animals that cannot communicate with them. They will stand in the rain for hours watching athletic competitions that have no direct bearing on their survival. They tell each other stories, elaborate, detailed, emotionally complex stories, about things that never happened, and they do this constantly, compulsively, as though the act of narrating fictional experience is as necessary to them as oxygen. When you first arrive on Earth, you think, this cannot be the species that developed faster-than-light capability independently. Then you spend a week watching a human grandmother teach her grandchild to bake bread, the patience in it, the precision hidden under the warmth. The way she adjusts her instructions not just to the task, but to the specific child, reading their frustration, recalibrating, finding a new angle. And you think, oh, I see. That is when you start paying attention in a different way. I spent my first year on Earth in what they call a university town, a mid-sized settlement built around an institution of learning, which is a human invention that still strikes me as extraordinary. The idea of constructing an entire community around the act of concentrated thinking. The humans living there were mostly young, in the middle portion of their maturation cycle, old enough to reason abstractly but young enough that the full weight of their world hadn't settled onto them yet. I was embedded as a visiting researcher from a cover institution. My translation implant handled the language. My bioskin handled the visual. To any human eye, I was a slightly tall, slightly pale academic from somewhere vaguely northern, which in that context made me entirely unremarkable. What I did mostly was sit and watch. I sat in their cafeterias, their lecture halls, their parks and coffee shops and late-night dining establishments. I watched them argue and reconcile. I watched them fall in love with a speed that seemed biologically reckless. I watched them grieve. I watched them take tests they'd prepared inadequately for and somehow still pass through a combination of compressed stress response and what I can only describe as creative improvisation under pressure. My reports back to the Commission were thorough, clinically thorough. I described their group dynamics, their social hierarchies, their communication patterns. I noted their tendency to use humor in high-stress situations, a behavior I initially flagged as a coping mechanism and later revised to something closer to a survival tool. I documented their relationship with sleep, which is chaotic and self-destructive and apparently something they do knowingly and without remorse. What my reports did not capture, because the Commission does not have appropriate data fields for it, was the quality of them, the texture of them as a species. The way a group of complete strangers would, within 40 minutes of meeting at a social gathering, be exchanging personal vulnerabilities as though they'd known each other for years. The way a single piece of music could stop a human in the middle of a busy street and hold them there, eyes going distant, transported somewhere the rest of the world couldn't follow. The way they laughed, not the social lubricant laughter I'd read about in the xenobiology texts, the real kind, the kind that bends them in half and makes them hold onto walls and leaves them briefly unable to function, and apparently constitutes one of their primary experiences of joy. I noted all of this. I filed it in the unofficial sections of my reports, the sections my senior supervisor, archivist Velmuntorathes, consistently flagged as anecdotal and insufficiently quantifiable. After 4 years, I was reassigned to Meridian Station. I thought it was a promotion. Observer Zethorian Savar has demonstrated consistent field competence over 4 standard years of Earth-based deployment. Observational data output is high volume and well documented. However, repeated flagging of anecdotal material and emotional commentary suggests developing observational bias. Reassignment to Meridian Station is recommended. Station environment is more controlled, multi-species, and will benefit from observers' established familiarity with human social behavior. The observer's tendency toward emotional engagement with subjects should be channeled into productive comparative analysis. The observer is not to be told about the current political situation at Meridian Station prior to arrival. We do not want this to influence baseline observational data. Velmuntorathes, Senior Archivist, Galactic Ethnographic Commission. Personal testimony, Zethorian Savar continued. I was not told about the political situation at Meridian Station. I want to be very clear about that because it matters. Because if I had known, if any of us on the observation team had known what was already in motion when we arrived, we would have conducted ourselves very differently. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we would have conducted ourselves exactly as we did, which is to say, we observed, we took notes, we filed reports, we told ourselves that our role was documentation, not intervention, and that the integrity of the record depended on our neutrality. We told ourselves that right up until the moment it became impossible to tell ourselves anything anymore. Meridian Station was one of the larger transit hubs in the outer galactic arm. 17 species maintained permanent residential quarters there. Another 30-odd maintained commercial operations, embassy outposts, or research facilities. The human presence was relatively new, 8 years established, at that point, and consisted of a diplomatic mission, a commercial trading operation, and a small cultural exchange program that had been running for 3 years. The cultural exchange program was, nominally, why I was there, to observe the humans in a multi-species environment, to document how they adapted their social behaviors in cross-species contexts. What nobody told me was that there was a faction within the Meridian Governing Council, led primarily by Vithrak Consortium representatives, that had been working for the better part of 2 years to have the human presence expelled from the station entirely. Nobody told me that 3 weeks before my arrival, those efforts had escalated from political pressure to something considerably less diplomatic. Nobody told me that the Vithrak had already decided the humans needed to go, and that if the Commission wouldn't endorse it, the Vithrak were prepared to make it happen themselves. I arrived at Meridian Station on a standard Thursday morning. I had been keeping human time, by then, mostly out of habit, and the first thing I noticed was that the humans seemed watchful. That was the word that came to me, not afraid, not aggressive, watchful, like they were paying attention to a frequency that everyone else was ignoring. I noted it, filed it under behavioral observation, subcategory, environmental stress response, probable cause, unfamiliar multi-species context. I was wrong about the cause. I have been on the Meridian Council for 9 years. I have seen disputes. I have seen political maneuvering of the kind that would make younger species faint with shock. I have navigated 3 separate trade crises, 2 territorial boundary challenges, and 1 incident involving the Pelorn delegation that I am contractually prohibited from describing in any document that might be made public. I want to say, for the record, that I never believed it would come to violence. That is not an excuse. I understand now that it is almost exactly an excuse, but I want you to understand my state of mind going in. The VTHRAC Consortium's argument in summary was this: the human presence on Meridian Station was destabilizing. They were too unpredictable, too emotional. Their commercial operations were undercutting established VTHRAC trade networks. Their diplomatic staff asked too many questions about areas that were, in the VTHRAC view, none of their business. The VTHRAC representative, a large individual named Toreth Ven, had been making these arguments for 2 years with increasing intensity. He was convincing. He was well-funded. He had allies on the council whose support I had not anticipated. And I foolishly thought we had more time. What I did not know, what none of us on the council knew, was that Toreth Ven had already stopped trying to win the political argument. Sometime in the 3 months before the incident, he had made a decision. I do not know exactly when. The investigation is ongoing. But the decision was this: the humans would be removed from Meridian Station by whatever means necessary, and the political process was simply too slow. He had brought soldiers. Not VTHRAC Defense Forces, nothing official, nothing that could be traced back to the consortium's governing board. He had hired them. VTHRAC mercenary units, contracted through shell organizations, brought onto the station in small groups over several weeks, staged in cargo bays and maintenance corridors, where the council's security teams had poor monitoring coverage. I did not know this until the shooting started. I want to make that very clear. I did not know. We knew something was coming. I want to be honest about that, because I think the commission report is going to dance around it, and I'm not interested in dancing. We knew. Not the specifics, not the soldiers in the cargo bays, not the timeline, not how bad it was going to get. But we knew the political situation had crossed a line, and we knew that Toreth Ven wasn't the type to accept a political loss gracefully. My colleague, Deputy Attaché Sira Akafer, had flagged it 3 weeks before. She's the one who started what the rest of us called the quiet protocol. Nothing official. Nothing that went in the reports because we didn't have hard evidence and we didn't want to look paranoid. Just informal adjustments. Staff started moving in pairs. Nobody walked through the lower maintenance corridors alone anymore. Ambassador Delacroix had her personal comm upgraded to a military band emergency broadcast on her own initiative without telling the council, because she'd done the same calculation Sira had done and arrived at the same conclusion. We also started keeping records, detailed ones, movements, conversations, anything that felt like it might matter later. Sira had a background in investigative journalism before she joined the diplomatic service, and she had this habit of documenting everything, even things that seemed small. She used to say, you never know which detail is going to be the one that explains everything. She was right about that. I should tell you about Sira. I'm going to need to tell you about Sira. Not yet, but eventually. The morning it happened, and I'm going to call it the morning, even though technically it was the station's artificial light cycle, not a real morning, because the distinction feels unimportant now. I was in the central promenade with 3 members of our commercial team. We were supposed to be meeting with a Pelorn trading partner about textile import schedules. Normal. Routine. The kind of meeting you have 40 times a year and barely remember the next day. I remember this one. The central promenade of Meridian Station measures approximately 340 meters in length and 80 meters in width at its broadest point. The ceiling rises 60 meters above the main floor, with transparent paneling providing a view of open space that station architects described, at time of construction, as the most viewed section of the galaxy accessible to ordinary travelers. The promenade serves as the primary commercial and social hub of the station. At peak hours, it holds between 2,000 and 4,000 individuals, representing the full spectrum of Meridian's resident and transient species population. It contains 86 commercial establishments, 12 food service locations, 3 diplomatic liaison offices, and 2 medical assistance stations. On the morning of the incident, the promenade was operating at approximately 60% of peak capacity. Sensor logs estimate 1,847 individuals present at the moment the first shots were fired. Of those 1,847 individuals, 312 were human. Personal testimony, Zethorian Savar continued. I was in the promenade because that is where I was supposed to be. My observational post was a cafe-style establishment near the northern end, where I had a clear sightline to approximately 70% of the main floor. I had been there for 6 days. I had a preferred seat. I had learned the names of 2 of the staff, which the Commission's protocols would characterize as excessive social engagement, and which I would characterize as trying not to be a ghost. I was drinking something the establishment called Terran-style coffee, as a nod to its human clientele, which bore only a philosophical resemblance to actual Terran coffee, and I was watching. I was always watching. The humans I had identified as regular promenade visitors were easy to spot after weeks of observation. There was the commercial attaché, Voss, who had a distinctive habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when listening to someone he didn't entirely trust. There was a woman from the cultural exchange program whose name I had recorded as Dr. Amara Osai, who spent her mornings making handwritten notes in a physical paper journal, which I found inexplicably moving. There was a young man, barely past the edge of adulthood by human standards, who worked in one of the commercial shops and who had, over the past 3 weeks, been systematically learning words in every language spoken on the station. I had watched him practice in quiet moments when the shop was slow, mouthing words to himself with an expression of focused determination. I had notes on all of them. Detailed, professional, scrupulously objective notes, with only minimal commentary in the unofficial sections about how, for example, the young man's multilingual ambition seemed to represent something important about human adaptability that I hadn't found adequate language to describe yet. I was watching Dr. Osai write in her journal. I was sipping my philosophically Terran coffee. I was thinking about an interesting interaction I'd observed the previous day between a Pelorn merchant and a human child that had produced some fascinating data on cross-species play behavior. And then I heard not a sound I recognized immediately, a sharp, hard crack like something breaking under enormous pressure, then another, then a third. I looked up, and everything changed. I heard the first shot and I thought it was structural. The station has mechanical systems, and sometimes things give way in ways that sound alarming but aren't. I thought something broke. I thought someone will fix it. The second shot was different. The second shot had a direction. I was sitting at my usual table in the northern cafe. I looked up from my journal and I could see, along the full length of the promenade, the way the crowd was changing. The way a crowd changes when something has gone wrong isn't like anything else. It doesn't happen in an orderly way. It happens in concentric circles like dropping a stone in water. The people closest to the source change first, and then the change radiates outward, and by the time it reaches you, you don't yet know why it's happening, only that it is. I saw it happen. I watched the ripple come toward me across 340 meters of the most beautiful public space I have ever occupied. By the time it reached me, the shooting had started in earnest. I want to tell you what I did first, because I think it illustrates something about training and something about instinct. What I did first was close my journal and put my pen in my pocket. I don't know why. I can't explain the logic of it. Every bit of rational thinking I possessed was screaming at me to get under the table, to move toward an exit, to do literally anything other than close a paper journal as though I were tidying up before leaving a library. But I did it. I closed it. I put my pen away. And then I got under the table. From under the table I could see the feet of people running. Different species have different running gaits. The Pelorn have a distinctive 3-beat pattern. The Vithrak civilians move in what looks like controlled falls from this angle, and I found myself categorizing them automatically, which is what a mind does when it's trying to process something it doesn't have a category for. I could see between the forest of running feet, across the main floor of the promenade, the origin point of the shots. There were soldiers. I counted later, but in the moment the count didn't register. What registered was armor. Heavy armor, matte black, with the distinctive shoulder ridge configuration of Vithrak military design. They had come from 3 directions simultaneously, one group from the south corridor, one from the western maintenance access, one from a service entry near the diplomatic liaison offices. There were many of them. I learned later there were 47. In the moment there were many. They were firing into the crowd. Not at anything specific, not at military targets, at the crowd. I understand the word massacre, now in a way I did not before. It is not just a word for a large number of deaths. It is a word for the specific kind of horror that comes when violence is directed at people who have no way to fight back and no reason to have expected a fight. I watched from under the table. I was a researcher. I was an observer. I had no weapon, no combat training, no capacity to change what was happening. I watched. And then I watched something change. Personal testimony, Rennick Voss continued. The first thing I did when the shooting started was wrong. I want to own that. My first instinct was to move toward the source, to understand what was happening, to assess the situation, to find the other members of my team and account for them. This is trained behavior. I have diplomatic security training, even if it's been years since I used it. And it was the wrong response to this specific situation, because the source of the shooting was where the soldiers were, and moving toward them was approximately the worst thing I could have done. Lena Marchetti, one of my commercial team, grabbed my arm so hard she left bruises. She said, "No, no." Just those 2 words. But the way she said them stopped me completely. She was right. I didn't understand why I was wrong yet, but she knew. She said later that she grew up in a neighborhood where she'd learned as a child what it means when that kind of violence starts, and the lesson her body had retained was, do not move toward it. That knowledge probably saved my life. We moved toward the eastern wall, away from the main corridors, using the commercial stalls as cover. There were already bodies on the floor of the promenade. I will not describe them in detail because I don't believe it serves any purpose beyond satisfying a morbid curiosity that this record should not be in the business of satisfying. What I will say is that I understood, in those first 90 seconds, that this was not a warning or a show of force or a targeted action against specific individuals. This was an extermination attempt. They had come to kill as many of us as possible. That was the plan. Clear the station of humans by removing the humans who were in the largest, most accessible public space. I understood this, and I will admit to you that my second response, after Lena stopped my first response, was fear of a quality I have not experienced before or since. A cold, cellular kind of fear that doesn't involve thoughts, just the body's ancient understanding that it is in mortal danger. My third response was something else. Personal testimony, Zethorian Savar continued. I need to explain something about my training as an observer. We are taught from the very beginning of our commission careers the principle of non-interference. It is not just a rule. It is presented to us as a philosophical foundation. The idea that observation changes what is being observed, that our presence in any situation must be as close to zero impact as possible, that our role is to witness and record, not to shape outcomes. I had believed in this principle for 9 years. I believed in it up until approximately the 90-second mark of the Meridian Promenade shooting. And then I watched a human woman run directly toward the soldiers without a weapon, and I stopped believing in it. Let me describe what I saw in the sequence it happened, as precisely as I can. The soldiers, 47 of them, though I didn't know the count yet, had entered the promenade from 3 directions and begun firing. The species on the promenade responded as most species would. They ran, they screamed, they sought cover. This is not cowardice. This is rational survival behavior. You move away from the threat. You protect yourself. The humans did this too initially. I watched it. Voss and his team moving along the eastern wall, Dr. Osei under her table, others pressing against shop fronts, sheltering behind architectural features, flowing toward exits. For approximately 90 seconds, the humans behaved as everyone else was behaving. And then, and I struggle to describe the quality of this moment, because I think it is one of those moments that does not translate well across species. Something shifted. Not all at once, not all of them, but enough of them. Enough that when I describe what happened next, I want you to understand that it was not spontaneous in the sense of chaotic. It was spontaneous in the sense of simultaneous independent decision-making, multiple humans arriving at the same conclusion without communicating it to each other, which is perhaps more terrifying. A man I had not observed before, he was a stranger to me, a human in civilian commercial clothing, middle-aged, physically unremarkable, stood up from behind a vendor's stall where he had been sheltering. He looked at the soldiers for 2 seconds. Just 2 seconds, I timed it. He looked at them with an expression I will try to describe accurately. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was something that I have since come to understand is a specific human emotional state for which they have many words in many languages, but which in English is perhaps closest to enough. He stood up and he shouted something in a language I didn't catch at first, and then in the translated version from my implant. Get them to the east exit. Move. He was not shouting at the soldiers. He was shouting at the civilians around him, giving them a direction, giving them a destination, turning the chaos of running into something organized. And people moved. Not just humans, Pelorn, Velthrin, Orish civilians who didn't know this man, who had no reason to trust him, heard a clear voice with a clear direction and moved toward the east exit. He started moving too. Toward the soldiers, not away. He didn't have a weapon. I need to be very clear about that. He was a distraction. He had made himself a distraction on purpose. 0914. 22 weapons discharge detected, Central Promenade source. Coordinates TH447, TH891, TH203, 3 simultaneous. 091424 emergency alert triggered, Central Promenade. 0914 31 station security forces notified, estimated response time, 14 minutes. East exit traffic surge detected. 340 individuals moving toward emergency corridor. 0915 17 additional weapons discharge detected, source. Coordinates TH447, sustained. 091544 anomalous movement pattern detected, multiple individuals moving counter-evacuation toward TH447. 0916 02 station security override requested, Central Promenade fire suppression denied, civilian obstruction risk. 0916 18 commercial establishment, Terran provisions accessed, non-standard entry. 091645 weapons discharge disrupted, TH891 sector cause unknown. medical bay emergency notification received from Central Promenade. 09/1730 secondary weapons disruption, TH203 sector cause, unknown. 09/1758 movement pattern, 23 individuals, human biometric signatures converging on TH447. I was having breakfast. I know that sounds like a strange thing to start with, but I want to paint the picture accurately. I was sitting in the eastern section of the promenade, off-duty, in civilian clothes, eating something the station food vendors marketed as a traditional earth protein plate, which was not traditional or especially protein-heavy, but tasted fine. I was reading something on my personal device. I had 3 more hours before my duty shift started. I heard the shots and I was under the table before my brain had finished processing the sound. That's muscle memory, years of it. From under the table I did my threat assessment the way I'd been trained. I counted discharge points 3, initially. I assessed the weapon signatures as military-grade VTHRAC pulse rifles. I estimated personnel count from movement patterns. I am not going to pretend this was calm analytical thinking. My hands were shaking. My heart rate was somewhere around 190 beats per minute. But the training runs parallel to the panic, and if the training is deep enough, it keeps running even when the rest of you is terrified. I had no weapon, civilian clothes off-duty, no sidearm. This was not a situation I had trained for specifically, which is to say, I had trained for it in every non-specific way, because the whole point of security training is that you never know exactly what situation you'll be in. What you know is your principles. What you know is your objective. My objective, when I assessed the situation and understood that this was a directed assault on the human presence in the promenade, was to get as many of my people out as possible. Not just humans. I want to be very precise about that. When I say my people, I mean anyone in the promenade who could not protect themselves and needed a clear route to an exit. That included 3 Pelorn children who had separated from their caregiver in the chaos. That included an elderly Velthran individual who had fallen and could not get up quickly. That included a Orish family who had pressed themselves against a shop front and were frozen, which is a known Orish trauma response to violence they hadn't evolved defense mechanisms for. My people, all of them. I came out from under the table, and I started doing my job. The first thing I did was get to the man who was standing in the open, drawing fire, giving directions to the east exit. I recognized him, Marcus Okonkwo. I learned his name later. He was a technical contractor on the station, not diplomatic staff, not military, not anyone who had any obligation to stand up in a firefight and start directing traffic. I came up beside him and said, "I'm security. I'm going to need you to keep doing that for about 2 more minutes." He looked at me and said, "Already planned on it." That was the full extent of our introduction. Personal testimony, Zethorian Savar continued. I watched Corporal Sato emerge from cover, and I did something that I am still not entirely certain I can explain to my own satisfaction. I got up from my table. Not to leave, not to move toward an exit. I got up from my table and I moved toward the eastern edge of the conflict, toward the position where I could see the soldiers most clearly, because something had happened in my observational brain that I hadn't experienced in 9 years of field work. I needed to understand what I was seeing, not from a safe distance, up close. The Commission is going to categorize this as a violation of protocol. They are right. It was. I do not regret it. From my new position, sheltered behind a structural column, perhaps 30 meters from the nearest group of soldiers, I could see what the humans were doing with a clarity that I couldn't have gotten from my cafe seat. There were 23 humans visible to me in that moment who were not evacuating. 23 civilians, off-duty personnel, diplomatic staff, commercial workers. None of them were armed in any traditional military sense. What they had between them was an improvised toolkit of the most extraordinary creativity. One woman, I learned later her name was Chen Wei, she worked in the promenade's medical assistance station, had taken the automated medical equipment from the station kiosk and repurposed the bioelectric emitter as a directed interference device that disrupted the targeting systems on V-Thrak pulse rifles. She had done this in approximately 4 minutes from the first shot. I watched her work and I remember thinking, very clearly, they are never going to be classified as pre-technological again. A man I recognized from the commercial shops, the young one who practiced languages in quiet moments, had done something with the promenade's atmospheric management system that I don't fully understand even now, but which reduced visibility in the southwestern quadrant by approximately 60%, creating a smoke-equivalent effect that disrupted the soldiers' coordinated advance without triggering the station's fire suppression protocols, which would have immobilized everyone. Defenders and attackers alike. He was 18 years old. I verified this later. Marcus Okonkwo was still standing in the open. He had been shot twice. I saw it happen, pulse fire, non-lethal setting, which I understand the soldiers used initially because their orders had been to create maximum panic rather than maximum casualties in the opening phase. He absorbed the hits and stayed standing. I do not mean this was painless for him. I could see the pain from where I was. I mean he made a decision about the pain, and the decision was that it didn't change anything. He was still giving directions, still coordinating, still functioning as the human equivalent of a navigation beacon in the middle of a firefight. I want to say something here, and I want to say it plainly, without the Commission's preferred language of clinical detachment. I have studied 46 sapient species over my career. I have documented their behaviors under stress, under conflict, under conditions of crisis. I have never, in 46 species, seen what I saw in the humans in that promenade over the course of 33 minutes. It was not that they were brave. Bravery, in its simple form, is a behavior I've documented across dozens of species. It is not that they were tactically clever, though they were, astonishingly so, in ways that would embarrass species who consider themselves militarily sophisticated. It was that they were simultaneously brave and tactically clever and emotionally connected and self-sacrificing and creative and organized and deeply, profoundly concerned with the people around them who could not protect themselves. They did all of it at once. That is what 46 other species can't do. Separately, any of those qualities exist elsewhere. Together, in that proportion, in that combination, I have no data point comparable. I heard the shooting from my office. My window looks out onto the promenade. It's one of the things I genuinely loved about the space, that visual connection to the public life of the station. And when I heard the first shots, I was on my feet at the window before I'd made the conscious decision to stand. I could see the full panorama of what was happening. I activated my military band emergency broadcast, which I had upgraded 3 weeks prior because I had seen this coming and nobody had listened to me. I broadcast on the station-wide emergency channel, the Commission monitoring channel, and the private encrypted channel of every human diplomatic staff member on the station simultaneously. The message was 12 words. I am not going to repeat those 12 words in this testimony because some of them are operational in nature, and I have been asked by the security section to keep operational communications classified. What I will tell you is that the message contained the situation assessment, the tactical status, and 2 instructions. The first instruction was, protect the non-combatants. The second instruction was, do not let them own this space. Those of my staff who were in the promenade received the message within 8 seconds of my broadcast. Those who were elsewhere on the station received it simultaneously and began moving toward the promenade within 30 seconds. I want to be transparent about my own role in what followed. I am the ambassador. I was in the diplomatic liaison offices. My security detail wanted me to evacuate to the embassy compound immediately. I told them I would do that in 15 minutes. I spent those 15 minutes on the communication systems, coordinating, getting people to positions, relaying information from Corporal Sato's continuous field transmissions to the staff who were converging on the promenade from elsewhere on the station, making sure the council was receiving documentation of what was happening, not my interpretation of it, the raw sensor data, the security logs, the evidence that would matter later when the political reckoning came. Sira Akafer, my deputy attaché, was already in the promenade when it started. I knew she was there. I was tracking her comm signal. I tracked her signal for the full 33 minutes. I am not going to talk about the moment her signal stopped moving. Not in this testimony, maybe not ever. Personal testimony, Dr. Amara Osai continued. I stayed under the table for 4 minutes, and then I understood that the situation had changed enough that I could do something. What I am about to describe sounds, when I say it plainly, quite extreme. At the time, it felt like the only available option, which I think is how most extreme things feel to the people doing them. The promenade's northern section, where I was, had been partially cleared of soldiers. The south and west were still active engagement zones. But in the north, the combination of the atmospheric interference that the young man from the commercial shop had created and the targeting disruptions from the medical technician had created a gap, not safety, but a gap. I am a cultural exchange researcher. My professional skills are ethnographic documentation, cross-species communication, and what my field calls contact linguistics, the study of how languages change and develop when previously separate groups meet. These are not skills that sound useful in a firefight. I used them anyway. I moved to the eastern edge of the promenade, where the evacuation corridor was still active. By this point, Corporal Sato and Marcus Okonkwo had organized a routing system, directing evacuees toward the east exit in groups, staggered to prevent bottlenecks, with humans positioned at the key decision points to guide panicking individuals who couldn't read the emergency signage fast enough. I joined this system. I am fluent in 4 station languages beyond standard. I could communicate directly with species that the other coordinators couldn't reach verbally. I stood at the junction point between the promenade main floor and the eastern corridor, and I directed traffic for 21 minutes. I did not close my journal this time. I left it behind. What I kept was my pen. I don't know why I kept my pen. The Pelorn children I mentioned earlier, they came through my junction point. 3 of them, holding hands in a chain, the oldest perhaps 7 standard years, which for Pelorn puts them at about equivalent to 4 in human development. They were making a sound I recognized from my contact linguistics work as the Pelorn distress vocalization. The eldest was trying very hard not to cry and failing. I took the eldest's free hand. I said in Pelorn secondary dialect, "I know the way, I'll take you." And I did. I came back. I came back 6 times. Document 5C. Personal testimony, Rennick Voss continued. When Lena Marchetti stopped me from moving toward the soldiers, we moved east. We moved carefully, using the commercial stalls as cover, keeping low, keeping the team together. There were 4 of us, me, Lena, Tobias Reinhold, our trade analyst, and Femi Ademi, who had been a medic in the civilian corps before she joined the diplomatic service. Femi's background became relevant almost immediately, because within the first 3 minutes we were encountering wounded people. A Pelorn male with a pulse wound to the secondary limb, a human woman I didn't recognize who had been knocked down in the initial stampede and broken something in her leg, 2 Velthrin who were physically unharmed but in such severe shock they couldn't move without assistance. Femi worked, she just worked. Moving from person to person with the supplies from a commercial shop's basic first aid kit, which is not a trauma kit and was not designed for pulse weapon wounds, doing what she could with what she had. I have worked with a lot of competent people in my career. Femi Adeyemi is in a category by herself. She would have been extraordinary under ideal circumstances. Under those circumstances, she was something I don't have the right vocabulary for. I coordinated. That's what I do. I'm a diplomat by training, which means I talk and I listen, and I figure out what different parties need and try to find an arrangement that works. I applied this skill set to a situation it was not designed for, and I am not sure I was particularly good at it, but I tried. I made contact with Corporal Sato through the embassy comm channel around the 8-minute mark. She gave me a situational overview in 45 seconds that was precise, accurate, and delivered with a calm that I found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. She told me where the soldiers were, where they weren't, which exits were viable, which were compromised. She told me that someone, Marcus Okonkwo, whose name I didn't know yet, was holding the center position and needed support. I told her I'd see what we could do. What we could do, as it turned out, was more than I expected. Document 5D. Personal testimony, Zethorian Savar continued. I watched the humans for 23 minutes before I violated commission protocol for the second time. The first violation had been moving from my observation post. The second violation was this. I used the Commission's Emergency Communication Authority to contact station security directly. I am authorized as a Commission observer to do this in situations involving imminent threat to the integrity of the documented record. This is meant to cover situations like natural disasters, station malfunctions, things that might destroy my observational data. It is not meant to cover situations like this. I used it anyway. I contacted station security and gave them a precise tactical layout of the promenade, where the soldiers were, how many, which positions were defended, which were exposed. I had been watching with an observer's trained eye for 23 minutes. I knew exactly where every one of those 47 soldiers was. I relayed the information in the most efficient format I could manage, which is to say, like an observer, which turns out to be quite useful in a combat information context. Station security had been trying to coordinate a response for 20 minutes and failing, partly because their sensors in the promenade were partially disrupted by whatever the 18-year-old had done to the atmospheric system, and partly because the chaos of the evacuation was generating so much movement data that their automated systems couldn't parse the threat signatures cleanly. I parsed it for them. I do not know how many of the outcomes in the final 10 minutes of the incident were affected by the information I provided. I am not going to claim credit I can't substantiate. What I know is that station security deployed their response teams in a configuration that directly matched my layout, and that the response teams reached the positions they needed to reach. What I also know is that by the time station security arrived in force, at the 30-minute mark, the humans had already changed the situation beyond what 47 armed soldiers had expected to encounter. Deployment report, Central Promenade response. Our response teams entered the Central Promenade at the 30-minute mark, 14 minutes later than our initial estimated response time, due to station-wide lockdown procedures and rerouting caused by compromised entry points. What we found upon entry did not match our pre-deployment briefing. Our pre-deployment briefing, based on the information available to us at the time of our initial response, had described the following situation. 47 armed VTHRAC mercenary soldiers conducting a sweeping assault on an open civilian space, with an estimated 200+ casualties and an unknown but large number of remaining hostages. What we found. The Central Promenade was divided into 3 distinct zones. The eastern third, approximately 110 meters of the promenade, had been fully cleared of hostile soldiers and was operating as an organized evacuation corridor. It was staffed by human civilians and off-duty human diplomatic security personnel who were actively routing evacuees toward the eastern exits. This section was coordinated, calm, and functional. By the time we arrived, they had evacuated an estimated 1,200 individuals through this corridor. The central third of the promenade was a contested zone. The remaining hostile soldiers, we counted 31, meaning 16 had been removed from action in the preceding 30 minutes through means I will describe below, were concentrated in this zone, their advance having been effectively halted. The means of halting them included atmospheric interference reducing their line of sight by 40–60%, targeted disruption of their weapon systems by a modified medical emitter, a series of improvisational physical barriers constructed from commercial fixtures and equipment that channeled soldiers into predictable movement patterns, and an organized system of harassment and redirection that, I want to be clear, was conducted by individuals without military weapons. The western third of the promenade, the original entry point for the largest group of soldiers, was the active engagement zone. The 16 soldiers who had been removed from action were in this zone. I will note, for the record, that removed from action in this context means incapacitated, not killed. Of the 16, 14 were alive and required medical treatment. 2 were in more serious condition but stable. None were dead. This last point deserves attention. Our briefing had suggested we would be dealing with human survivors of a massacre. What we found was different. The humans had engaged 47 soldiers for 30 minutes with improvised tools and no military weapons, and had done so in a manner specifically calibrated to stop the violence rather than escalate it. I have been in Meridian Security Command for 11 years. I have never written an after-action report anything like this one. Personal testimony, Dr. Amara Ose, final section. I came back from my 6th trip through the eastern corridor, and I stood at my junction point, and I looked at the promenade. It was not quiet. There was still sound, the ongoing engagement in the center and west, the distant coordination communications, the sounds of people who were hurt or frightened or both. It was not safe. It was not over. But it was different from what it had been. I stood there and I thought about something I had written in my journal that morning, before any of this started. I had been writing about my research into the human concept of Ubuntu, a Southern African philosophy that translates roughly as, I am because we are. The idea that personhood is not individual but communal, that what you are is partly constituted by your relationship to others. I had been writing about how unusual this concept was in cross-species context. Most sapient species have individual identity as primary, with social bonds as secondary. Humans have something more complex, a deeply individual identity that is simultaneously and inseparably social. They are alone and together in ways that seem contradictory until you see them in action. I had been writing this as a theoretical observation. Standing in that promenade junction, watching Marcus Okonkwo still standing in the center of the space he'd been holding for 20 minutes, watching Corporal Sato moving with the precision of someone who had never once considered leaving, watching Femi Ademi work her way through the wounded with the focused care of someone who had decided that each person in front of her was the only thing that mattered right now. I was watching the theory become real. They weren't doing this for survival. They were past survival calculation by about minute 3. They were doing this for each other, and for the Pelorn children, and for the frozen Orish family, and for the elderly Velthrin who couldn't move quickly, and for people they didn't know and would never see again. I kept my pen. I lost my journal. I don't think I lost anything important.